Hey everybody, and welcome to another Tausken review. Today we'll be taking a look at Sea Salt, a game that feels like Pikmin set in a Lovecraftian universe. The premise is pretty simple. You're basically an old god set on vengeance upon the bishop of your own church. It's a pretty simple story that's just told through some basic grunts sim style, sound-wise, with some basic dialogue. There's nothing amazing here story-wise, but it's enough to keep you going and enough to build in sort of a background to the universe. You control a mob of zealots and monsters that act like a plague sweeping across the land. Wherever your pointer is set is where they'll go. It's very much like Pikmin in that way. And then you can hold the right trigger when you're playing on like a controller, which will cause them to just attack whatever your target is. The controls are a bit of a mixed bag. I felt like sometimes when I would tell people to attack something or do something, they wouldn't always respond in that way. There's also some weird occasions where like they be an attacking enemy and they'll just sit there be chomping on like a piece of wood or something, which is ridiculous. Along the way, you'll unlock new cards which will let you call in new units. There's a pretty great diversity of units, from the simple swarm like zerglings, the glass cannons cultists that do range attacks, the defensive crabs that are incredibly defensive but have really bad attacks, worms that can produce slime that slow down enemies, to even more advanced monsters like necromancers that can revive dead into ghosts, or trees that can root units in others. The diversity is pretty great, but I felt like some units were just really hard to use. For example, necromancers, you only get one when you call them in, so they're super squishy and weak, and I didn't feel like their ghosts that they produce are really worth the cost. Fishmen, by contrast, are incredibly useful. They are probably the most useful unit I've found in this game. They're incredibly beefy, and they do a ton of damage. Sort of like having the best of the Zergling unit that you have, the Swarm, and having the more defensive unit, the Crab, combined into one. It's not quite as defensive as a Crab, and it's not quite as fast or as damage dealing as other units, but they're still very much a strong, solid unit. And so I felt like the backbone of my army could basically be made out of these and just kind of wipe things out, whereas a lot of these other units just kind of died really fast or didn't really have much of an impact on the battlefield. The scenarios are well crafted to require a diversity of units. You can try simply brute forcing with one unit type, but you'll find that some enemies will require you to kind of mix things up a bit. I did find though that some of the difficulty spikes in the scenarios was a bit much. At times the game just kind of spikes around, where like towards the later stages there's some areas that just get ridiculously hard to compare to others that were pretty easy. It felt like maybe there just could have been some better testing here to try and refine and smooth out the curve a little bit. The enemy diversity is pretty great. You'll start off fighting simple waves of peasants, but quickly move on to dealing with tougher enemies like fast-moving pirate guys that have guns that can just obliterate your units really fast, your samurais that will cut through straight lines of your units, killing a bunch. There's even like things like Molotov throwing peasants that can just wipe out a bunch of units, or armored knights which can slam their weapon down, creating massive AoE blasts. It's a real blast trying to discover the weaknesses of each enemy. Early on I found that I could just wipe out mobs of enemies with swarms or cultists, but I quickly found that I had to adapt my strategy to some new enemy types that just tore them up. The special attacks these enemies have also require a lot of skill and precision with moving your swarm to avoid them. This also leads to one of the biggest issues with the game. The pathfinding is atrocious. Oftentimes you'll have units that just get stuck or unable to make it to your pointer, or they'll be walking into walls. This can make encounters feel a bit RNG and frustrating to deal with when your units don't obey your orders exactly and end up getting killed. Along your journey through the campaign, you'll also run into bosses. These are a bit of a mixed bag though. I like some of them and feel like they have interesting mechanics, but most of them were honestly pretty easy, and I could honestly just kind of cheese my way through a lot of them. You also gain access to apostles along the way, which are basically classes in the game. So they give you access to different abilities or bonuses, so one might have stronger swarm units and start you out with swarm, another will have you start with cultists, another one might not let you choose what units you bring in and instead will give you a choice of 3 to pick from. Graphically, Sea Salt is a very pleasing game to look at. It's low quality and it's kind of indie-like, but it does a great job with its style. It very much invokes that sort of Castlevania Lovecraftian look. My only complaint with the graphics is sometimes the game throws in just way too many like environmental effects. They'll have like smoke and gases and clouds and weird things like floating through the air, and it can be very difficult sometimes when you're just looking for your units and trying to make decisions when there's all this stuff just flying around everywhere. Especially when you lose units because the game starts to get kind of cloudy, and then it can be kind of difficult to make out what's going on. Overall, I like Sea Salt a lot. It's a ton of fun, and it's got a unique graphical style to it and also gameplay. It's like Pikmin meets Castlevania, which is really cool and unique, but it has a lot of issues. The pathfinding when you're just trying to get units to do simple things is a joke sometimes, the readability can be really difficult with the graphics, and the bland bosses really hold this game back. But despite that, I really enjoyed the feeling of controlling this unstoppable swarm and the challenge of trying to complete objectives with that unstoppable swarm. There's a lot of challenge here, just trying to move, control your units, making decisions on what kind of cards to play for what units you want. It's awesome in that way. And as a result, Sea Salt gets a 7 out of 10. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but it's definitely above average in a unique game that brings fresh ideas, which is something we all want to see in gaming.